Following from the previous video, we now have no radiator fan. So the next thing to do is to remove the two discs that are behind the radiator fan and the two auxiliary belts. The first auxiliary belt is the one that powers the power steering pump, and the one that I'm removing right now is the one that powers the alternator. If your 4Runner has air conditioning, you probably will find that one of these belts is plugged into something else as well. But here you see I'm just removing both the discs and the belts. Then the next thing to do is just to reach out and take the top plastic cover, the black one. And I'm just pointing out where are all of the bolts. So there's 4 bolts on the top that have spacers where those plastic clips go in. Then there's 2 deep bolts in there in the middle. This bolt is a shallow bolt. Here's another shallow bolt further out. Then you can see in the middle of the screen another shallow bolt. And one thing that I didn't point out is that to the left there's another bolt. So just using some tools to speed up the process and remove the cover. Now here I'm going to show you what's the next thing to remove. It's this black bracket. This black bracket is in the way to remove the silver bracket that is to its right, and you'll need to remove 4 bolts on it. Then the silver bracket has 3 bolts. So you can see the access to the first bolt, it's fairly simple. Then the second one, the first bolt I'm removing, it's a stud with a nut, but the second one, it's just a nut. So the third one, it's actually easier to get to it from underneath, but here I'm just cracking the power steering tension nut. So this one is tighter than everything else, so I needed a bit of extra leverage. And then underneath this, which it's easier to reach from underneath the car, there's the third nut. Which I'm trying to access from. Well, this is not the nut that I'm referring to, this is the same bolt that that is used on the power steering adjustment. And here I am removing the third bolt that is holding the bracket into an extension. After removing these 3 nuts, the bracket comes out without any kind of struggle. The next thing to do is to remove the crankshaft bolt. So here I'm just pointing out where the crankshaft bolt is, and then you can join me on the adventure that was to remove that bolt. So I initially tried to use a very long breaker bar, and I put the car into gear, and it turned out that I was just moving the car. Then I tried my air gun, but my air gun wouldn't reach. So then I tried to create another bracket to hold the auxiliary pump, the auxiliary belts, and attach them to the crankshaft pulley. But that didn't work out either. Even though I removed the auxiliary pulleys, I could not actually get a good grip into them. So following this removal of the auxiliary belts, you can see the 4 nuts where I tried to use my extension, which didn't work. So following all of those failures, I have gone to the last resort, which is to just attach the breaker bar to the chassis of the car and then use the crank. Just crank the car a tiny bit, don't start the engine, just crank it, break the nut, and then everything becomes loose. And this works very nicely, even though it's not an approach that I like to use. But as you can see, once you crack the nut, you can remove it by hand very easily. So the next thing to do is to remove the clutch fan bracket. And you may find that the bolts are a bit seized, so you may need a bit of extra leverage to remove them. But they're not difficult to access or anything, so I can't imagine anyone having any difficulties with this. At this point, I realized that the clutch front bracket wasn't gonna come out easily, because I needed to remove the timing belt tensioner first. So here I'm just pointing out the two fans, the 2 bolts, and the bracket that the timing belt tensioner is hitting and that it's blocking it. So you just need to remove those 2 bolts, and off the timing belt tensioner comes, and just don't lose any of this, and stuck it. So now the clutch fan belt comes out very easily, without any struggle. Then the next thing I've done was to remove the plug on the thermostat. So the reason I'm doing this is because I'm changing the water pump. So the thermostat is attached to the water pump, you need to take it apart anyway. So it's a very straightforward task. And the next thing I've done was to remove the bottom plastic cover of the timing belt. Now the camera didn't really get a good shot in here, but there is, I believe, 3 bolts, if I remember correctly. One of them is a bit hidden, but they're easy to get to, especially if you try to access from underneath. Now, the next thing that I've done was to get the crankshaft bolt and put it back in place. And the reason I've done this is so that I could turn the timing belt all the way up to its top dead center position and align every single one of the 3 important cogs. So we're looking at the left camshaft, the right camshaft, and the crankshaft. Here you can see this is the right crankshaft, and it lines up just like this. You have an arrow and you have an indentation. You need to make sure that these are lined up. And the left crankshaft, you have the same thing, but you don't actually have an arrow. You just have a little indentation in both, the crankshaft and the shell. Now at the bottom there's also markings to line it up, and we will get to those a little bit later in the video, but I just want to point out that you need to line these up. So after you have aligned the timing belt, you just pull it out, not a big deal. I'm just checking if it was in poor condition or not, and then you can get started with changing the idler pulley, which is a hell of a nightmare to do. So we got these 4 bolts that you can see me pointing at, and well, I was trying to record, but I lost the footage for that, so you get the idea on where they are. Anyway, these 4 bolts are needed. I need to remove these 4 bolts to get to this metal cover, and to pull out the metal cover you have to do a bit of jiggling about, because the metal cover has a little bracket-like kind of metal bit that you will see in the video in a second. So when you're pulling it out, you need to be careful so that it doesn't catch onto the fuel lines. You can see me pointing at it right now. Then there's 4 bolts that I'm pointing at in here. They are very easy to see. Unfortunately, they are extremely difficult to reach. I don't have the appropriate tool to reach to this, so the best tool to use on this would be a 1/4 or a 3/8 of a drive with one of those flexible tips. But since I don't have them, I had to figure another way to reach them, and this is where my journey starts for something that I believe took me about 2 hours to figure it out. But I had to push the fuel rails out of the way and try to figure out how to move the fuel rails and the ignition leads, so that I would be able to reach behind some of the bolts, reach behind that plastic cover. That's the plastic cover of the fuel, of the electric ignition leads. No, that's not for the ignition leads, that's for other electrical stuff. The ignition leads are in front. But then I have the fuel rails as well, so it's difficult to reach, but if you don't have the best tool for it, it's doable. So here's the idler pulley coming out, and a new idler pulley going in. Now I've just tried to clean a tiny bit there, but the thing is the new idler pulley has its own gasket, so I'll just have to confirm that even though the place looked dirty, it was actually completely flush. And since it was, all I had to do is just put the new bolts in. So after the idler pulley is back in place, we just need to put the little bracket, the metal bracket, back in. And of course, everything that I had to take apart to get access, well, had to go back in. So what you see in the footage is a bit of that. So I'm not putting back the stuff that holds that plastic cover in place, and the fuel lines and the ignition wires, ignition coils, not coils, the ignition leads. So after all of that, just the bracket goes back in, and we have an idler pulley finally done. Yeah, the idler pulley was a massive faff, and I really hope that there's a better way to do it for next time, but I couldn't find anything online telling me how to do it. So if you know how to do it, just leave a comment with a link to your video, with a link to the forum discussion, whatever. If there's an easier way, please let me know. Then the next thing I've done was to remove the tensioner pulley. So all we need for this is just an X key of the correct size, plenty of leverage, because as you can see, with the normal socket wrench I couldn't get it done. So then I just had to get some extra leverage on my socket wrench. and then because of I wasn't getting anything and I was a bit of getting hurt, I've decided to just use a breaker bar instead. And we will get to that in a second in the video. But as you can see, I was trying pretty hard to break that loose, and just it was getting to the point of being dangerous. So as soon as I used the breaker bar, since I was confident that I wasn't going to get hurt, it was very easy to break that nut loose. And as you can see here, because the connection between the drive and the bit is a square, but the bit is an hexagonal bit, if you rotate the connection by 90 degrees, you actually get a different access point. Anyway, after removing the tensioner, I've just gave the water pump a little bit of a clean, and here there's a bit more of lost footage that where I was pointing out where the bolts for the water pump are located. Here I'm just taking the hose out of the bottom side of the water pump so that the water pump will come out easily. I've initially tried to use normal pliers, then I started using plumber pliers until it just came out. And here you can get a rough idea of where those bolts are located in the water pump. Now later on in the video you will see where the bolts are when you get the opportunity to see the new water pump going in. So you get an idea of where to look for. Then to remove the water pump, you may need to use something to prise it off. You don't necessarily need it, but I needed to use a little screwdriver to do it. After the water pump comes out, you separate the water pump from the thermostat, which in my case it was more challenging than I initially expected, so I had to use some precision tools for it. Now, in order to not damage the thermostat, I just use a wooden block instead of using a hammer directly into the thermostat. So then thermostat goes into the new water pump, and here you get an idea of where each one of the bolts that holds the water pump is located. The new water pump comes with a new gasket and a new thermostat gasket. So the way to do it is just to grab your thermostat, remove the old gasket from it, and you can see here where the new gasket goes. So I just remove the old gasket from the thermostat, check it away, put the new thermostat around, put the new gasket around the thermostat, and place the thermostat back into the water pump. Now ideally you would be changing the thermostat as well, but it's actually very easy to access them from underneath the car, so I didn't see the need to do this job right now. Before the water pump goes back in, I just gave it a little bit of a clean. Make sure that there's no residue of the old water pump gasket in place. Put the new gasket into the new water pump and line it up with the 1 or 2 bolts so that it won't slide off when you're positioning everything together. And yeah, just put it back into the car. This is far easier than doing the idler pulley. And the nice thing about the 4Runner is that once you remove the fan shroud, you can actually access there with an impact drive, speeding up the process. Then don't forget to connect the return hose again into the new water pump. This probably would have been easier done from underneath. It sure would have easier access to the clip. And now I'm positioning the tensioner again. Now this is actually wrong. I'm positioning the tensioner in the wrong place in the video, but I didn't have any footage of doing it in the right place now. So I'm just pointing out where the tensioner needs to be in here. So the tensioner needs to be bolted close to the left timing belt, the left crankshaft. Now I have a Gates timing belt, and I'm just showing that there's markings on the timing belt that will tell you left cam, right cam, and you need to line these markings with the markings that we have looked at earlier. So I have highlighted the markings with some Tipp-Ex here, and I'm just trying to show you where they are. So you see the timing belt here is not lined up, and this is because by the time I recorded this, I already had run the car a bit. But when you position the new timing belt, you should line up those markings. So here's the markings on the right hand side. As you're hopefully able to see, there's the arrow, and there's an indentation outwards from the arrow, and there's another indentation on the car itself, or on the engine. You can see that on the left hand side there's no arrow, on the right hand side there is an arrow, and then in the bottom, in the crankshaft, you have an indentation and a marking to match it, which is a bit difficult to see in the video. But if you zoom in, you can see that there is a bit of a cut in one side and a bit of a edge on the other. So after all of this is lined up and the timing belt is placed back in, what I've done was just put back the thermostat enclosure and just made sure that it's snug. Not a big deal. And you can see here that my footage is now different. I have a different lighting and such because I did this separate part of the footage in a different day. Anyway, now I'm in the process of putting everything back together. So the first thing that I put back together was the plastic cover on the bottom, which I decided to access the bolts from underneath because it was easier, and just use my air wrench. Then the crankshaft auxiliary belt goes back in, and you can see that there's a little indentation there. So when you're putting it back in place, you gotta try to wiggle it until you find the place where the indentation goes, and then it slides further in. And this is very important to line it up correctly. So just continue spinning it around and pushing it in until it locks into place. As you can see, I managed to spin it. At a certain point I couldn't spin it anymore because it locked into place. Then the crankshaft bolt goes back in, and you just tighten it as much as you can. But just remember that if you start tightening it and everything starts spinning with it, well, you need to then move on to a different tool. In my case, I just used the breaker bar, which you won't be able to see in the video, and the car with the handbrake on so it wouldn't move. Then the radiator clutch fan bracket goes back into place, and you can see that there's a bit of a technique on when you put it back in because of the tensioner. You need to wiggle it up and down as you are pushing it in order for the tensioner to adjust itself, or well, the tensioner pulley. The next thing to do is to put the tensioner in place. Now, if you are unlucky like me and your tensioner came without any kind of locking pin, you need to put your tensioner in the vise and use something as a locking pin. What I have used was just a nail, and place the roofing nail in the tensioner to hold the tensioner inwards, as you can see from this picture. Now just make sure that you put your nail on the top side of the tensioner. As you can see that there's this little angle bit that I will be pointing out in a second. Again, this angle bit, this is the top, so your nail needs to be pointing towards you when you're fitting it, so that you can then remove it after the tensioner is guided in place. Now, putting the tensioner for me was particularly difficult. The access didn't really work very well, but I eventually managed to put it back in place, and the goal is just to line up the two bolts, you know, thread them a little bit, and then grab some pliers, pull your pin out, and you should be able to see a little bit of a... No, there was no visible, noticeable. It wasn't visible in the camera, but as the pin came out, I could see the belt being stretched a little bit. And then there's two bolts, as I showed earlier, and the easiest way to do them, it's actually from underneath. One of them, it's extremely difficult to do from overhead. This one that I'm doing right now should always be done from underneath, and the other one should be done from wherever you feel more comfortable. So now you can see that the tensioner is pushing onto the pulley. So now we can move on to the three big bolts that holds the fan bracket. Now I'm only putting them here now after the tensioner intentionally. There's one thing to note, is that there is two bolts and one stud with a nut. Even though I call them all bolts. So the stud with a nut, which is longer than everything else, goes underneath, and then the two bolts go in the other two slots. So after this is all tightened in place, you can put back the black bracket that is holding the power steering. So as you can see, this is the position that it needs to go back in, and just make sure that you remove the little bolt that does the tensioning on the power belt, on the power steering pump belt. Make sure you remove it, because otherwise things won't go back in, and then you need to put it back into place. Now, putting this bracket is trickier than it looks, particularly the bottom, the third bolt on the bottom, that needs to line up with the bracket that comes from the engine bay. I had to do a bit of jiggling about to actually line up the bolt with a hole. But after that was done, I had to put back the auxiliary belt pulleys. So the auxiliary belt that I've worked on was the top one then, which you didn't even get a chance to see. And after that, it's just to go. We just go to the big black plastic cover. Now these are all 10mm bolts, from what I remember. The four ones on the top are the ones that have spacers, so that the leads, the ignition leads, can clip into there. Then the next three that I'm doing are the short bolts into this is the third one, and then there's three long bolts. Now I'm going to point them all out in just a second. So this is a short, and also a short one. This one and those three are all the long ones with the spacers. and the last 3 are the longer bolts, which are all in the middle of the plastic bracket. Then you'll find yourself with 4 nuts. These 4 nuts are for the top, for the radiator fan bracket or clutch bracket. So you just need to make sure that you put these together, and you can see the position of the first pulley. It actually goes towards the inside, and then after this you need to put the 2 belts. Now the V-ribbed belt is the first one to go, which is the one that drives power into the alternator to the right. And then the other belt, the other auxiliary belt, is the one that goes into the power steering pump, and it's the one with the teeth. So after these 2 are in place, you can then go back and put the radiator fan, and the radiator fan will clamp everything together. So I'm not going into that because I already have a video for that, but you get the idea. So I hope this helps you fit the timing belt on your 4Runner. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.